Hello, and welcome to this special webinar exploring effective leadership in multilingual international schools. My name is Tom Beeks from the Bell Foundation, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Um, the webinar is going to start with a presentation from our speaker, and then there will be hopefully 10 or 15 minutes for questions and discussion at the end. So please do put any questions you've got in the chat, and I will do my best to put these to Jacob later. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and although we can't share the slides from the webinar, we will share the recording with you via email after the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand you over to our speaker today and introduce you to our guest, Jacob Huckle. I'm sure many of you will already know of Jacob and his excellent work on issues around multilingualism and inclusion in international education. Jacob is head of multilingual learning at Dulwich College, Suzhou in China, which he somehow combines with doing a doctorate in education on the topic of multilingualism in international education. So he's in a rare and really valuable position of being extremely knowledgeable about the theory and research, but also in a position to see how it actually looks and works in practice through his role as an educator and school leader himself. So over to you, Jacob.
Okay, thank you very much. Great to be here. Great to see everyone and talk about this important topic today. I'm just going to share my slides. So, for today's session, we're going to be talking about effective leadership in multilingual international schools. And I just want to apologize at the start because I've come down with a bit of a cold, so I may be sound a little bit croaky or a little bit groggy at times. So apologies for that. Um, so our topic today, exploring effective leadership in multilingual international schools. There's four kind of questions that I think we're going to explore and think through as we go through today's session. I want to think about what's distinctive about leading in a multilingual international school. What's different when we're leading in linguistically diverse or bilingual environments. What kind of paradigm shift do we need within EAL, and what kind of leadership does this shift demand? And then what are the responsibilities of all leaders in multilingual international schools? And here I'm talking about all leaders from heads of year, heads of department, deputy heads, or principals, not just the EAL leadership. But then I'm also thinking within this paradigm of shared responsibility, shared leadership responsibility, what is the role of EAL or the multilingual learning specialist in this paradigm, and how might that shift and change? How might we rethink that? And finally, what are the competencies that all leaders need to develop to lead effectively in multilingual international schools? So, based on what we've talked about, what skills, what knowledge, what attitudes or attributes do our leaders need to develop? So, I hope there's a lot here that will be relevant to those of you who are joining as EAL coordinators or EAL leaders, heads of EAL teachers. But I also hope that this is something we can discuss through the lens of all leaders in school, and then there'll be something that other leaders from in other kind of aspects of school leadership can reflect on and think about. And if you are EAL coordinator, maybe there are some things you could take back and share with the other leaders in your school, or some discussions you might have. So just to get us started, I thought it would be nice just to post in the chat. So if you can open the chat box, and just want you to type the word more or less in reply to these questions. So just type the word more or less. Um, has in recent years, has the number of EAL students in your school become more or less? Are there more or fewer EAL students now than there used to be? Okay, I'm seeing mostly more. Thank you. A few less. Um, has the among the EAL students, has the variety of their profiles become more or less various? Is there more or less diversity of different kinds of languages, different kind of needs, different kind of language profiles among your EAL students? More, I see some more, less, or the same. Someone said much more. Okay, thank you. Um, are the support needs of your EAL students becoming more or less? Do they have more or less kind of support needs in terms of their language support or other kind of support that they need in order to access the curriculum? A few less and some mores as well. And how challenging is it to ensure effective provision for these EAL students? Is it more or less challenging than it was in the past to ensure that your provision is working for all of your EAL learners? For any kind of reason, it's becoming more or less challenging. Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure if everyone can see the replies because some people have set to host, but I will just summarize. Yeah, for every question there were a few less, but I think the most responses were more for all of those questions. That's my kind of brief impression from looking at the chat coming in that I can see. I think this shows that there is a complexity to language in international schools, multilingualism in international schools, and as part of that EAL. Um, School leadership is always complex, but I think that leading in a multilingual school is particularly complex, or it has its own distinctive complexities. And we're going to think a little bit about why that's the case and what might be distinctively complex about leading in a multilingual school or a school with many EAL students or school with different language profiles of students. I think there are a number of reasons why it's complex, and I'm just going to briefly run through some of them. And some of these you might recognize in your own school context. Some of them maybe not. But let's have a look. I think that there's a complexity in meeting the needs of students with diverse language profiles. We may have students coming in with who are just beginning learners of English to more advanced learners of English. We may have students who need specific additional support in terms of their speaking skills. Other students have more holistic needs. Students coming from different educational backgrounds, etc. And this diversity of needs creates a complexity that we need to embrace, and we need to think a little bit about what kind of leadership that complexity requires. Um, as we know, teachers in our schools come from various different contexts with different past experience of working in multilingual school contexts or with EAL learners. Maybe as teachers come straight from their home country, teaching in a mostly monolingual school context, so they may find it's challenging to adapt. Teachers coming from different countries may have different frameworks being used, different terminology being used to talk about multilingual learners. So this adds a layer of complexity. We also know that the whatever improvements we make in trying to build inclusion, trying to challenge the perceptions and include our multilingual students and EAL students, they're still having to face high stakes assessments in one language or the language of instruction, which makes a big challenge. So students making a lot of progress in their English development, for example, but they're still struggling to access the assessments that are based on a monolingual paradigm. And many international schools have a high turnover of staff and leadership, which makes it challenging to create a shared vision about how we're going to support EAL students or multilingual learners. We may build up a lot of understanding among our staff about strategies and our vision for multilingual learners in our school. But then if many of those teachers have left and new teachers come in, or new leaders come in, we need to keep building up that kind of shared knowledge and shared vision can create another complexity. As we know, parents and families have different expectations about language use and language development, and they may different families may have very different opinions or even misconceptions about how language should be used. So that makes another layer of complexity that we need to navigate as school leaders. And of course, unlike if we were teaching back in our home country where there may be some kind of national requirements or some provision, in an international school there's no regulation on a national level around EAL. So that means we have to invent things for ourselves. We have to work with different organizations, and that adds another layer of complexity when we're thinking about EAL or multilingual learners. So I think leading in multilingual international schools, as we said, is complex, and it's not only complex. I think it's becoming more complex as your responses to the posts to the questions earlier suggested. In many schools, becoming more complex. And I think there are a number of factors to explain that. And I'm not going to talk about all of these, but just to give you an impression. In many international schools, I hear teachers talking about the changing demographics, and partly as this is coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic or other political changes or other economic changes in various countries. We see that the makeup of our student bodies is changing. In some schools, they've gone from having a few a small number of EAL students. Now the majority of students would be classified as EAL students. We have different kind of students coming in. Students maybe have a greater need for scaffolding to access the curriculum. And at the same time, in some schools, there's been no change in the EAL staffing or resourcing to reflect this increasing needs and complexity. We also see in recent years new types of international schools or different types of international schools emerging, which means we need to maybe think differently about what it means to learn language in an international school. We have growth in bilingual schools and teaching in a bilingual school, teaching different languages using different subjects or using the different languages adds another layer of complexity that teachers and school leaders may not be prepared for. Of course, we also know with recent emphasis in some schools on diversity, equity, inclusion, there's a growing awareness of some of the injustices and discrimination in international schooling that are related to language, such as native speakerism, monolingual bias, linguistic discrimination. But these problems continue despite this growing awareness. And of course, we live in a complex, rapidly changing, interconnected world with many other social issues that impact on the complexity of leading in multilingual international schools. So when we think about these complexities and these increasingly complex context in which we teach and lead, I wonder what kind of leadership do we need in this complex context in a multilingual international school? And I wonder if our current approaches are working, whether we need to rethink the way we approach leadership around languages, EAL, multilingualism. I think and I'm building on the work, or I'm referring to the work of Dr. Virginia Rojas, and I've put the link onto the PowerPoint, and maybe we can share that later. And the article she wrote about the paradigm shift, moving out with the old medical models in with a new ecological response, and her thinking around this has been quite informative for me and has shaped my thinking a lot. So, what does this paradigm shift mean? Let me just paraphrase and summarize as well. So, we need to move from a medical model response in which EAL is approached like a problem that we need to fix, which we can see is kind of rooted in a deficit mindset that these EAL students are not ready to access the curriculum. Maybe we need to improve their English as quickly as possible before they can be integrated into the school body. And in this kind of paradigm, EAL specialists or EAL teachers, EAL coordinators are seen as the fixers of students, the ones who are going to help them to improve their English. And we're having a kind of support service delivery model in which those students may be pulled out from some lessons, given some intensive support until they can be integrated into the curriculum. And I'm not saying there's no place for these kind of approaches. There is a place for these kind of approaches. But if this is the only kind of paradigm that we're existing in, I don't think it's enough. And we're going to always be trapped in this cycle of wishing we had more EAL staff, wishing we had more support for EAL, more EAL teachers. So what we need, and this is what Dr. Virginia Rojas argues for, is a paradigm shift towards more of an ecological response, in which we're not just looking at the EAL staff to work with the EAL students, but we're talking about a whole school ecosystem in which everyone has shared responsibility for EAL. And then the role of EAL specialists is to collaborate and advocate for the students rather than to be the only ones who are responsible for improving their English until they can access the curriculum. And this demands the integration of content and language development across the whole curriculum for all students, including EAL learners. Reframing the curriculum through the lens of language is something that all staff, all teachers need to be doing. And therefore, we need policies and systems that leverage linguistic diversity and promote inclusion. And some of that may involve pull in, push out support in the kind of traditional approaches that we use, but we also need that to be part of a bigger whole school-wide shared responsibility for multilingualism and our EAL students. So think you may pause and kind of reflect on your own school and where you're at in this paradigm shift. And some schools are doing well in making this shift and building these other kind of responses. And I think this shift demands a different way of thinking about leadership. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. So let me share one example. And just as a kind of an example, I've chosen to illustrate this. A school may be grappling with a leadership challenge, something like this. In the school may find that recent assessment data shows EAL students are struggling to access the curriculum in English. So this triggers some kind of need for a response. And what might that response look like within the medical model paradigm? The response may be, let's ask the EAL team to provide additional language support until they're ready to access the curriculum. Let's provide more EAL support with the EAL team. But what about if we look at this through an ecological response? Might we then start asking different questions of different kinds of leaders in the school as well, such as this? Does the head of assessment, and I'm just imagining these kind of roles that may exist in school, does the head of assessment need to look at ensuring our assessments are effectively scaffolded to capture EAL students' progress? Do the heads of department need additional training from the head of EAL to better embed language scaffolding within their units? Could the heads of year arrange home language buddies or other kind of pastoral support to offer further guidance to the EAL learners to support them in accessing the curriculum? Does the deputy head of academics need to review whether the curriculum is culturally relevant for the learners? So here we can see in the ecological response, the responsibility for the EAL students' progress is not just with the EAL team, but with all leaders in the school who look at their area of responsibility through the lens of language to think about how they might contribute and respond to this need within the school. I think to summarize what I'm saying here, all leaders have a sphere of influence or a sphere of control that impacts on the inclusion, academic success, and well-being of multilingual or EAL learners, not just the EAL staff. So we start to see this as a shared responsibility. The decisions that the head of year makes, that the principal makes, that the deputy head makes, etc., all impact on EAL students and multilingual learners in different ways. And therefore, we need to be attending to that. We need to consider that and bring multilingualism and EAL learners into our sphere of concern. So it's something that all leaders care about and think about, and also into their sphere of influence and control, so that they are taking action to ensure inclusion, academic success, and well-being for all learners of different language profiles within their school, not assuming that that's just the responsibilities of the EAL staff. So what I'm saying here, I think, to summarize this point, is we can't rely on some heroic EAL leader or EAL coordinator or EAL team who's going to come in and work with those students. And that cannot be our only response. And I've been in that situation in the past, and it does lead to burnout and frustration for the EAL staff, because there's never enough time, there's never enough resources for just this to be a few people's responsibility in the school. Instead, we need collective leadership. If we're going to lead for multilingualism, lead in a way that embraces linguistic diversity, its opportunities as well as its challenges, We need collective shared leadership amongst all the school leaders in the school, and that needs to be intentional. And I think this collective leadership needs to be responsive and transformative. So let me explain a little bit what do I mean by that. I think that all school leaders have two responsibilities in multilingual sort. There are many others, but in terms of what are the implications of linguistic diversity for school leaders, we need to be responsive. We need to respond to and navigate the challenges and opportunities presented by linguistic diversity. We know, for example, that multilingualism has many cognitive benefits. How equipped are the academic leaders within a school to be able to respond to that, to celebrate the linguistic diversity within the school, to see this as an asset? We also know it brings some challenges. How equipped are the school leaders to be able to respond to and navigate some of these challenges? If, for example, a situation arises where there's some discrimination among students around language or exclusion of students around language or accent, etc. How equipped are the staff to be able to deal with this in a way that understands that language is closely tied to identities, and this is not this may be different from other kinds of bullying within the school? How do they have the knowledge to be able to navigate those things when a teacher, when a parent may raise a concern about the school's language policy? How equipped are the leaders within the school to respond to that in a way that aligns with the research and best practice around, how languages are learned and developed in schools? So that's about being responsive. We also need to be transformative or transformational. All leaders need to think about their area of influence and control and how they might lead shifts towards inclusion equity for linguistically diverse students. To think about the impact of their decisions and when they make their decisions, what kind of students do they have in mind? And are they thinking about how these decisions may impact differently on students of different language backgrounds or language profiles? So I think this is the kind of call, the leadership calling for all leaders in a school, in a multilingual school, is to think, how are you responding and navigating to these challenges, and how are you being transformative to ensure that your area of influence, your area of control, is building more inclusion and equity for our multilingual learners or EAL students. So let me share a couple of examples about what this could look like. Let's first think about a head of assessment. And I don't know if your school has this kind of role, but let's just use it as an example. What does it mean for a head of assessment to be responsive to linguistic diversity? Rather than just thinking about the things they usually think about around assessment, maybe it's about assessment validity, different assessment methods used within the school, when's the testing happening, etc. Then if you are being responsive to a multilingual school, then that person will also need to consider how assessment methods might be differentiated so students with different language profiles can demonstrate their learning. What kind of different assessment methods could we share and educate teachers around so that the learning of linguistically diverse students could be captured so that the language barrier is not getting in the way of them demonstrating their learning? This is a specific kind of knowledge that the head of assessment would need to develop to be able to lead within their area of influence and control effectively in an international school. There are specific things you need to know about assessment access arrangements, for example, or about different ways that translanguaging can be used as part of the assessment process. This head of assessment would also need to pay attention to possible inequities or injustices within the assessment approaches. That might mean this head of assessment analyzing assessment data to identify the areas in which EAL students might be underachieving and advocating for more scaffolding within those classes to ensure those students can meet the potential. If the head of assessment is dealing with some kind of data analysis, is EAL represented as a cohort within that data analysis so that teachers and other school leaders can be held accountable for the progress of their EAL students? Those are kind of things that the head of assessment may build up or processes they may put into place. So that's one example. Another example, let's take a head of department. I'm thinking of head of maths or head of science, something like that, or head of year in a primary school context. Again, if we think about what does it mean for a head of department to be responsive and transformative within a multilingual school context. For example, that may mean that the head of department ensures that the units that they're planning within their team and with their team have opportunities for students from diverse linguistic backgrounds to use their other languages to support their learning. In other words, embedding translanguaging and EAL strategies within the unit plans. Is the head of department checking on those things when the head of department's leading the development of new units? Are they looking at those units through a language lens, etc.? And on the transformative side, this may mean that the head of departments considering things like the culturally responsiveness of the curriculum, so that students from different cultural backgrounds do not feel alienated or excluded within the curriculum. Considering the different examples that are used within the curriculum, the case studies, is there a representation of all students within the curriculum? I hope that head of department is thinking about these things as well as the other aspects of their jobs. And these are things that they may not have had to think about before in if they're coming from a different kind of school context. But these are definitely things that are necessary to be able to lead in any kind of area in a multilingual school. So that gives you just two examples. And if you're going back to your school working with your teams, this might be something that you look at to with your teams as a kind of PD exercise to get people to think about their role, either as a teacher or as a school leader. Think about what's within their area of control, area of influence, what are the things they work on, and then to think about what does it mean to be responsive to linguistic diversity and transformative within their role. How might they respond and navigate the challenges, and how might they lead these kind of shifts? So this is a nice thinking task you may do with your school leaders to get them to reflect on this a little bit. So I wonder then, and you don't have to share, just reflect for yourself, to what extent do the leaders in your school embrace these responsibilities already? To what extent are the leaders in your school already thinking in this responsive or transformative way? I'm I worry that some schools are still like this, and let me read this quote from Merton's book. The people with power, the governing bodies, school leaders, and administrators are unaware and unconcerned with linguistic diversity, language learning, or acquisition, and they tend to view second language learners as a problem rather than as a resource. The people who are concerned with these ideas, such as the English as second language teachers, the mother tongue teachers, and the foreign language teachers, are comparatively powerless, and their voices are seldom heard. I wonder if you recognize this description in your own school or other schools that you know about, where the people in power don't seem to be so concerned with language and issues related to language or multilingualism, and those with the expertise who are concerned and want to do more to help don't have enough power to be able to make that kind of difference on a school-wide level. I think this is my kind of summary of this in the power and expertise matrix. I think we want to avoid this situation just described in that paragraph, where we have school leaders who have the power to make changes, but they lack expertise about EAL or multilingualism. So they could be leading on these school-wide initiatives. They have the positional power within the school. They're in the senior leader meetings. They're in the middle leadership meetings, but maybe they lack awareness and understanding about effective EAL approaches or multilingual approaches. At the same time, those people within the school who do have that specific expertise may lack the power to make the changes within the school because maybe that head of EAL or the EAL is not represented within those senior leadership meetings, for example. So I think we want to avoid this kind of situation and instead aim for a situation where we move the school leaders along to the high expertise part of this matrix. In other words, we develop that EAL or multilingual learning expertise in all school leaders. And at the same time, we empower the EAL and the multilingual specialists. So of course, you can see bringing these two things together, skilling up the EAL, sorry, skilling up the school leaders so they have expertise and knowledge and understanding around EAL, and empowering the ELL and multilingual specialists who already have the expertise but maybe lack the power to make changes. Bringing those two groups together will be really beneficial for the school. Of course, this requires collaboration, intentional collaboration between the different stakeholders and different leaders within the school. I think it also means there's a changing role of the EAL leader, the EAL teacher, the EAL specialist, or the multilingual learning specialist. And again, I'm building on Virginia Rojas' work and a recently published article she wrote with John Nordmeyer about this. And again, let's frame it in this different paradigm shift. Within the medical model response, we're thinking about the EAL teachers, the EAL leader, the head of EAL, or EAL coordinator. This is what leadership of EAL looks like. And these people are working within a kind of caseload support framework. That's how they discuss it in their article. In other words, they're assigned their particular EAL students. They may work with them at particular times, or they may work with them in the classrooms. And they're managing that caseload and helping those students to improve and developing their language. And as we said earlier, those other people have responsibility for fixing those in inverted commas those EAL students. But if we're talking about this shifting paradigm in which every leader is responsive and transformative and takes on responsibility, then what's the role of the EAL leader? Do we need the EAL staff? Of course we do, but we see their role as slightly different. And this is in the article, they suggest rather than EAL teacher, EAL head of EAL, etc., we can think of them as multilingual learning specialists. Again, this is about valuing the expertise that they bring and the expertise that they can share with the other teachers and leaders in the school. So they talk about reframing traditional era EAL teachers as multilingual learning specialists, not just in name, but with pioneering roles and responsibilities. In other words, it's about what I said, empowering those people with the specialist knowledge. And they describe three different ways we can think about the role of multilingual learning specialists. They are consultants, working with the teachers, working with the school leaders to advise and work on particular projects. If, for example, we notice that the science curriculum is not very language friendly, then how can the multilingual learning specialists work with the science team to build that curriculum? Again, they are as the collaborators, maybe sometimes going into those lessons, sometimes co-planning, co-assessing the learners, working together with the homeroom and content teachers, and also as coaches to advise the teachers, advise the students, using their specialist knowledge about language acquisition. In other words, the multilingual learning specialists are working with and supporting all other leaders and teachers to take multilingualism seriously and to act responsively and transformatively in a multilingual context. I think this is what we need from our EAL specialists, multilingual specialists as leaders within the school context, within this new ecological paradigm. So, of course, this requires that all leaders develop particular competencies because we're expecting more of them. We're expecting them to be able to navigate these complexities. So maybe that requires some specific leadership competencies as well as the more general leadership competencies that all leaders will be developing. And in my chapter, I talk about this as the head, heart, and hand competencies in the leadership for multilingualism competencies. When I talk about the head competencies, I'm talking about the knowledge and understanding that leaders require to lead for multilingualism, lead in ways that promote inclusion, academic success, and well-being for EL learners or multilingual learners. There are certain things that we need to know, and we need to understand if we're working in a multilingual school with different languages, different students with different language profiles. For example, we need to understand what the process of language development looks like. We need to understand that it takes a long time for students to develop academic language, and that knowledge should guide us in our decision making about when we need to provide certain classes, certain curriculum, etc. We also need to, for example, all leaders need to understand, have knowledge of EAL teaching strategies so that if the head of department's observing a lesson, to give feedback to one of their teachers, they need to understand what kind of effective strategies could be used in that lesson so they can give useful feedback to that teacher that helps them improve. There's particular knowledge and understanding that we need leaders to have. Beyond just knowledge and understanding, in the heart dimension, I'm thinking about the attitudes and values. Leaders need particular attitudes and values and beliefs in order to work in these lead effectively in multilingual contexts. We can think about, for example, having an asset-based mindset in which we recognize the strengths and values of multilingualism and the opportunities it brings to our school rather than just seeing problems that we need to address. Or it's about being curious about different languages. Are the leaders in our schools learning greetings in the different languages so that they can greet parents and students in assemblies using different languages? Are they demonstrating this open-mindedness and respect that we expect to see of our students? Are they engaging in language learning themselves, especially the language of the country where they are living? And then on to hand, I'm talking about the skills that leaders need, the things they need to do, the action they need to take within the schools in order to lead in multilingual contexts. I think there are specific things we need to be able to do. For example, we need to be able to communicate clearly with multilingual audiences. When we're speaking to delivering a presentation to parents. Let's imagine the deputy head is delivering a presentation to parents, and the parents speak various different languages. There are ways they will need to modify their communication style to use English as a shared international language or to work with translators to simplify the language that they're using so it's accessible to their audience. These are particular skills that need to be developed and practiced if you want to lead in a multilingual school context. So, this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to give a few examples, and I'm not going to read them all. But here's a few examples of things, and I mentioned some of them in the kind of head dimension, and I talk about some of these in my chapter. For example, understanding how languages are acquired and learned, and different ages and language profiles and what it means, and the difference between learning a first language, learning a second language, the different terminologies we use in school to talk about languages. That's important things for people to understand. I also think we need to, on the second last bullet point there, understand that language is more than just a communication tool. Language is closely tied to identities. So any decision that we make that impacts on the languages that students use, impacts on their identities. So we want teachers to and school leaders to understand that and know about that. So those are some examples. And if we had more time in an interactive workshop, we'll be able to list other examples. That may be something you can go back to your schools and think about. What are the other things that we want all the leaders and teachers in our school to be able to know and understand? In terms of attitudes and values, I think it's about appreciating linguistic diversity, approaching languages with curiosity and open-mindedness, being committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in multilingual contexts. Once we develop these kind of values, then we see more things like translanguaging and inclusive pedagogies being implemented, or at least people trying to implement those approaches in their school. Skills means, for example, being able to build relationships, communicate effectively with people from different backgrounds, being able to identify and challenge linguistic discrimination, teaching skills around effective pedagogies like content language integrated pedagogy, EAL strategies, etc., etc. So I think these head, heart, and hand competencies, there's just a few examples here. It's interesting for you to reflect more and discuss with your teams what are the other things that we want all school leaders to be able to know, believe in, and do in order to lead effectively in our multilingual school context. So this is a leadership challenge, and I'm quote here from this article to leave you on this note. Multilingual learners can no longer be the few students in the back of the room whose ideas we'll tap into later when they're able to share them with us in English. Their participation in class discussions and critical thinking processes is an increasingly important element of our shared future. We'll need students with cultural, linguistic, and intellectual flexibility to be able to cross borders, bridge communities, and help solve the global crises we face, whether climate change, ethnic conflicts, or perhaps the next pandemic. This is the leadership challenge and opportunity that we want all leaders in our school to embrace so that those multilingual learners are fully involved and integrated and able to use their linguistic diversity to enhance and enrich our school communities for everyone. So I think that gives you an insight into what I mean and what it might mean to lead in multilingual schools. Just so in case you want to know more, um, what I've talked about today is based on the chapter which was included in this book. The chapter's called Leadership for Multilingualism Framework. What do we need to understand, believe, and do to lead in multilingual schools? So, if you want to know more about what I've shared, that might be a good place to have a look. And I have some other kind of citations in there you may want to follow up. This image on the left is a summary from the article in which I summarize this framework and some of the ideas I've mentioned today. And I've also put some links there, which I think we're going to share in the chat of other resources, including the summary of the chapter and some other articles that I've read, which are um, linked to leadership, particularly, and how we might lead effective provision or effectively lead for EAL and multilingualism within our schools. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm very happy to take any questions or discuss any points a bit further if anyone would like to ask any questions.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was
Thank you.
really fascinating and yeah, so many incredible issues and questions you've raised there. In terms of the links at the end that you put on the slide, just so everyone's aware, I'll be including those in the email that we send out with the webinar recording. So you'll get access to all those links via email. So don't worry if you didn't get them all, and I've put some in the chat as well. Um, well, I think we're waiting for some questions to come through. I'm sure some will, but I mean, I've got plenty of things like I'd like to ask you about based on that talk. And I guess one question I have is that I'm aware that probably a lot of the people watching are EAL specialists. Um, and you talked about the power expertise matrix, and that perhaps a lot of our EAL experts may not feel they have the power or be in the position to make some of the changes that we've talked about. So I guess the question is, how do you manage upwards to advocate for the needs of plurilingual learners, or what, do you have any advice?
I think like with any change, we can think about any kind of change process. I think is Kotter's model of change, right? It starts with this idea of establish the urgency or the need for the change. So I think that's where I would start is to have those discussions with the senior leaders or the other leaders within the school to talk about how maybe due to these changes we're seeing in our school community, the changing demographics, the increasing
Yeah.
number of EAL students, for example, this is why we need to shift to a different kind of approach. So I think establishing that need and getting them on board with that, and then helping them to understand what that kind of, if we're talking about collaboration, what that collaboration might look like in your school context. So maybe setting up those kind of pilots or trials of how you could work together with different senior leaders or
Mhm.
school or middle leaders within the school and starting there. So it might be about starting a project with one particular team, maybe the maths department, the head of maths. If you
Yeah.
have a good working relationship there, that as a head of a EAL teacher working with the head of maths and show that this kind of collaboration can be very effective to
Yeah.
build up the knowledge and expertise of the maths head of maths so that they can share it with their math teachers and so that all students can benefit from that support rather than us always being the ones to find out, oh, what's the maths curriculum so I can support the EAL learners? How about we try to do it the other way around? And then once we can create those success stories in particular
Yeah.
context, in particular collaborations, then hopefully the other school leaders will start to realize that and start to understand the kind of the benefits and power of this more collaborative approach.
Absolutely. And I think I was reiterate there, like I think that is the really important starting point is to establish that need for change. And I think
Yeah.
that often comes down to collecting evidence. And
Mhm.
often that for senior leadership, evidence means data and
Yeah.
statistics and things like that. So I think that's where this links back to things like, making sure you have a really robust assessment,
Hmm.
EAL assessment in your setting so that you can measure progress and you can see where
Yeah.
there might be gaps and you can see where there might be some areas where they're doing really well and areas where they might need more support. I
Hmm.
think that's really important. And then yeah, that idea as well of finding your collaborators and the people who can work with you and
Yeah.
like identifying those. I don't know what you. Uh, I've heard people use terms like EAL champions or people
Yeah.
that, um, yeah, your allies who might just be a teacher that you happen to get on with and share a kind of similar way
Yeah.
of thinking about. And maybe you can develop those relationships and find out what's working and identify those success
Yeah.
stories in your school so
I
that you
think
can
so.
present that
I think
information.
there's putting our resourcing energy into working with those leaders who are interested and willing to kind of engage with these ideas is probably more
Yeah.
effective than spending all our time trying to change the minds of those leaders who maybe are not going to change their minds. Once we find those people who can maybe they could be called the early adopters or
Mm,
the initial collaborators who we can start this. If we can work with them
mm.
to build up this and then show it can be successful, then I think gradually we'll start to see bigger changes within our schools.
Yeah, yeah. And Martin has asked a couple of questions, which I think you've spoken to a couple of those in terms of
Yeah,
suggestions for resources and strategies, and I'll share a couple more before the end of the webinar, Martina.
yeah,
But Mag's just made a really interesting point there, which is, I don't know if there's a an easy answer, but the hard truth is that in some schools, EAL teachers are still treated as second category
mm,
teachers, and so shifting them into a more of a, I guess, specialist or consultant role could be tricky. And yeah, I don't know where you would start with with that.
yeah. I think so. I think that's a very important thing for us to talk about and recognize. And it goes back to the matrix I was talking about. We see how um, they may have this expertise and this knowledge and they're the ones working with the students and they're able to work effectively with the students and how much the other teachers in the school, other leaders would benefit from that knowledge. But as mentioned in the question, they are even maybe even less powerful, seen as a lower status than other teachers. So regardless of the kind of leadership status. So I think that is a hard truth that we need to recognize, and it does require some reframing and thinking. And I think if you can speak to your school leaders about that and put forward a proposal and list the kind of specialist knowledge and some of those skills and the knowledge points that I mentioned in my chapters that we've talked about today, that there is specialist expertise that's required. And we as a EAL team, we have this expertise. These are the trainings we've done, etc. And we want to share that with everyone
Mm,
else. I think it's very if you start having those kind of conversations, and maybe I'm being too idealistic, I don't know, but to be able to go to your school leaders and say, oh, we really want to do a PD session about how we can use this EAL strategy because we think other teachers would benefit. And I think it would be hard for a school leader to say, no, we don't want you to lead a PD for
yeah.
to skill up staff. That would be a strange thing to say no to. So if you start asking these questions, say, and then it shows those leaders that we do have this expertise. And I
Mm,
think whatever you share, the other staff will be really interested to hear that. And I think that just having those, like starting those conversations, we want to share more about translanguaging. We want to share about different language acquisition stages or how you can use the Bell framework to as assessment in a class or something like that. The more that we say, I want to share this with staff and can I do that, they start to see the expertise that we
yeah.
have. And I think there is a power in if you can get that going, then like it's talked about in one of the links you shared for me earlier,
Mm,
changing the job title, changing the
yeah.
job role
Yeah.
to
I was
something
gonna.
like multilingual specialist or something signals that change and can be a refresh within the
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
about that kind of shift that we're going to want to have within our staff. And I think also if the senior leaders know this is what a skilled EAL
Yeah.
expert looks like. These are the qualifications they need because it's different from other roles. There's especially if you're working in a British international school, you know, we don't have a PGCE in EAL in from a UK context. So there are different kind of skills and qualifications that we should be looking for
Mhm.
in our EAL staff. So do
Yes.
those people involved in recruitment need to know what that involves?
I was going to mention that. I think that is at a very practical level. It's perhaps just looking at your job description to begin with and
Yeah,
really seeing, A, does that reflect the expertise and the skills that your staff have? And does it need
yeah,
to be updated or does it need to be rewritten to make it a bit clearer, like what skills
yeah.
these teachers are bringing? And
Hmm.
even, and it is just sometimes like explaining what is a CELTA, what is a Delta, these kind of
Yeah.
EFL qualifications that won't be known to senior leaders
Hmm.
from mainstream education, but just making it clear what they are and what that means and what expertise that brings.
Yeah.
Because yeah, again, yeah, you can get that two-tier sort of situation, unfortunately, in some
Mm.
schools. This relates to the question that Eva's just put it, which is about this idea of promoting multilingualism, and how do you make a case for a dedicated head of multilingualism as the head, and she's the head of department and also a Spanish teacher. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I have certainly my own thoughts on that. What would you say here about?
Yeah. I'm posting one article in the chat which was on my final
Mm,
slide, but I'll share it there as well. So this is an article I wrote with two other heads of multilingualism, or heads of multilingual learning. And in that article, we talk about how we shifted from our positions, various other positions in schools, into head of multilingualism. And I think there's definitely a need for this kind of role, a dedicated person. If your school's, you know, interested and willing, have a look at that article I shared, which just has like three case studies of what that looked like in my school, and two other heads of multilingualism that I collaborated with. I think this is, and ideally, this role, this person can be the link between the various different language faculties and teams within the school, the link between the MFL department. And the EAL team, the English teachers, the mother tongue teachers, etc. I think putting forward this kind of argument for this role and explaining, yeah, this is what this role involves, this is why it's better or different, this is what it's going to add to the school context. I think if
mm,
you can advocate for that, it can be really powerful. And I think one of the best ways is to see it as a evolution from an existing role within the school, to say we
yeah,
want to expand the role. For example, if you're head of MFL, you may feel, and you feel that this is something you'd like to do, you may put forward a proposal, say, want to expand beyond just MFL to include this and this.
yeah,
And in the future, once this is built up, we're going to need someone else to come in and take over the MFL because we can't do everything. And I definitely agree with that statement. It's not possible to manage everything alone. We need we need everyone to take these responsibilities, and then the head of multilingualism is the link person between all of these people, and the collaborator and the coach and the
and
consultant, as we said.
yeah, absolutely. And I would add the schools that I've seen do this really successfully, their modern foreign language department, their languages department work quite closely with the EAL team or the English as additional
Hmm.
language there, or they're not even seen as that bit as separate because actually what they're
Yeah,
doing is the same thing. They're teaching language. And
yeah.
so like for me, again, a really critical thing is making those connections between what you bring as a language teacher, whether it's
Hmm.
Spanish or English or whatever the additional language, whatever languages are being taught. Um, and because I think there's a lot of good practice in language teaching is good practice for teaching full stop. And actually,
Mm.
it's often much better embedded in language teaching than it perhaps is in other areas of teaching. So, to give an example, um, things like spaced practice, which is now
Hmm.
very trendy in the UK, is this idea and retrieval practice in terms of building learning and it's evidence based and there's a lot of science of learning. Well, language teachers have known this for years, right? We know you don't just teach a bunch of vocabulary and then it magically is in that child's head and then you move
Mm.
on. You integrate it, you revisit it, you review it, and that's something language teachers have been doing since year dot, right? And that's actually something that for some teachers and other subjects is a sort of newer idea, and we have all these strategies and ideas that can bring that in. The other one is oracy, which is becoming a really popular
Yeah.
trend at the moment in the UK because of changes to the curriculum here. And again, language teachers, we bring oracy into the classroom all the time. We have language practice because we understand intimately that necessity for that, and linking, if you as a language expert, if you can link that to the sort of more general teaching practices that your school wants to embed, like you look at your teaching and learning policies and find those
Mhm.
connections. That's really
Yeah.
powerful. Um, that is, yeah. There was somebody also, Sharkila, there commenting that, yeah, okay, that she's got a lot of experience in schools, and she's contrasting the differences between how her EL teachers are viewed in her existing school and how they were in the previous school, which again speaks to some of the things we've been talking about, doesn't it? It's a mindset shift.
Mm.
Teachers have always been seen as in the background. How do you then
Yeah.
make them
How
more
do you
influential?
Yeah, how
And
do
it,
you build up the confidence of your
yeah,
EAL teachers who have always been in the background? Because this is a what we're talking about here is a different kind of expectation, different kind of role.
yeah,
If we're the EAL teachers, we're asking them to then work more with other teachers rather than just directly with the students. So, and on co-planning in the subject. So I think that is a challenge if to shift that. But the good thing from what the comment says is that the school leaders are on board with it. So that's the most, I think that's the hardest challenge to overcome. So now we need to think about if I was working with this school leader, think about, what are the strengths of your EAL team, those EAL teachers, and then building on those strengths as a way, tapping into those strengths as a way of building their confidence. If there's one member of the team, for example, who's really interested in something, and it can be something small like designing games to practice vocabulary with the students, then maybe you could encourage that person to um, work with some other staff to share that knowledge. Or why don't you in there's going to be and if they're not confident enough to do it on a whole school level, slowly coach them and build up their confidence. Why don't you go to the science department meeting next week or the year 3 meeting and tell them about the games that you've been playing with the EAL learners and how they could do it, and work with them to design a science game. And also, if you've got EAL staff who come from various different backgrounds, some EAL
mm,
staff, for example, they have a background in science or something in a
mm,
previous career. That's a way of building up their confidence and saying, this person in our school has knowledge about science as well as knowledge about EAL. So how can we partner them with the science team? So starting small on those kind of little projects, I think will build up the EAL teachers' confidence so that they can then start to take it forward in a bigger way.
yeah, yeah. But it is a big, it's not a short-term fix, is it? It's something that will
Yeah,
take time
exactly. Yeah.
and to change those sort of school cultures because
Yeah.
they can be really embedded.
Hmm.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to share my slides again with the group, with everybody, and yeah, and I'd just like to say, first of all, a huge thank you to you, Jacob, for your insights today. It's been, extremely thought-provoking, and you raise a lot of really important issues. And yes, there may be more questions and answers sometimes, but I would urge people to, yeah, read some of the links that Jacob shared, and also some of the articles he's written on this to really clarify your thinking on this and how it might look in your school. Um, so yeah, thank you so much for those
Thank
contributions.
you.
Um, I would also just at the end of our webinar like to signpost some of the foundation's resources that might help you. So, we've already heard from Jacob about the power expertise matrix and how do you ensure that you have expertise in the right places. Well, we have some online courses that might do just that for you. So, if you would like to support the Bell Foundation and develop your own knowledge and skills, I can direct you towards some of our online courses, and the most recent ones are up there. I'd like especially um, alert you to our new course, which is specifically for school leaders. So if you do have a leader in your school who'd be open to learning more about multilingualism, you can direct them towards this course, and it really goes into a lot of the things that Jacob's talked about in this webinar in a lot more depth, and allows them to apply that. And I'd also like to mention our accreditation scheme as well. If you want to showcase the amazing things you're doing in your school as well as developing your provision, please have a look at that. Okay, well, just leaves me to say a massive thank you again, Jacob, and also thank you to everyone who came along and posed your questions. I hope you found it useful. And yeah, all the best for the rest of the school year and beyond for everyone. And we'll see you next year at our webinars. So thank you
Thank
and
you.
see you
Thanks
next time.
everyone.